Welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video. Today we're going to answer the question, how much are resident physicians worth? Let's begin in Albuquerque, New Mexico, home of the University of New Mexico Hospital, which is pictured here. Because see, in August of 2019, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, or ACGME, they withdrew the accreditation of the University of New Mexico's neurosurgery program. Now this by itself was noteworthy. Residency programs don't lose accreditation very often. In fact, in 2019, the University of New Mexico program was one of only two neurosurgery residency programs to lose their accreditation. But there was another reason that this story caught my attention. See, there were 8 neurosurgery residents who had to leave the University of New Mexico program. And when they did, the university hired 23 advanced practice providers to replace them. In other words, it required 3 paid professionals to replace the clinical work that was previously accomplished by each of the neurosurgery residents. And since the average neurosurgery nurse practitioner earns around $115,000 a year, nearly twice as much as a resident, the loss of accreditation ended up costing the university 5 times as much as they would have paid if they'd just been able to keep their residents. But when you see stories like this, it makes you wonder, what is the financial impact of a resident on the hospital for which they work? What are residents really worth? The short answer is a lot more than they're paid. You know, at the hospital where I work, you want to know what the most dreaded time of the year to be on call is? It's not Christmas. It's not the first weekend in July. It's not even Friday the 13th. It's the first weekend in November, and that's because that's the weekend when all of our residents go away on a retreat to a local resort. So, if you're the attending on that weekend, you suddenly become responsible for every aspect of your patient's care. And I don't mean in some kind of philosophical or medical legal sense, but in a very gritty, minute-to-minute sense. All of a sudden, you're the one in the trenches writing the H&Ps, processing discharges, fielding the pages from the nurses, and entering a lot of orders. Lots and lots of orders. And look, I'm not trying to trivialize resident work because a whole lot of it requires skill and judgment and compassion. But yeah, there's a lot of orders. I've always thought that the value of the residency retreat is twofold. In part, it provides valuable bonding time and much deserved R&R for the residents. But just as importantly, it provides a visceral reminder to the attendings of just how much work the residents do. But the question is, how much is that work worth in real dollars and cents? And the answer to that question is, it's complicated. Although in theory it shouldn't be. I mean, in theory, you could estimate the financial value of a resident just by creating a balance sheet. All you'd have to do is total up the total revenue brought in by residents and then subtract the cost of training them. And the cost of training residents is pretty straightforward. I mean, you got to account for their salary and their fringe benefits, and you got to account for the salaries and benefits of the program leadership and the support staff and, some miscellaneous program expenses here and there, which vary from program to program. But all these figures are figures that can either be directly obtained or reliably estimated. But the financial benefits of training a resident, the revenue that's attributable to having residents, that's quite opaque. And so even though this basic arithmetic is simple, getting reliable numbers to crunch isn't. But you know what? Today we're going to take a shot at it. So fair warning, even though I'm going to provide just a brief overview of some of these issues, this is inevitably going to result in some trips into the weeds. Let's start at the top with patient care revenue. This ends up being a surprisingly difficult figure to get at, in part because, with rare exceptions, even though resident physicians provide a lot of care, they aren't usually directly billing for their services. Now, of course, their attendings do, and having residents usually allows an attending physician to bill more. I mean, the more time an attending neurosurgeon spends on scut work, the less time he or she has to spend in the OR engaged in the gainful practice of neurosurgery. But you give a neurosurgeon a team of residents, and they can practice at the top of their license by spending the maximum amount of time doing the most remunerative portions of their job. But just how much value an individual resident can add is highly variable. I mean, imagine if the ICU is already full, Adding another internal medicine resident, it lightens the workload for the whole team, but it doesn't result in any additional attending billing. And in some circumstances, it's at least possible that adding a resident could actually reduce attending billing. I mean, the average private practice dermatologist may be comfortable seeing 50 plus clinic patients a day, but they're probably not going to be able to keep up that pace if you make them precept a resident. Similar considerations may apply to other outpatient heavy specialties like family medicine, or even specialties like radiology and pathology, where it's possible that having to teach junior residents may actually slow down the amount of billing that an attending could have done otherwise. But the point is that to whatever extent having a resident allows an attending to manage more patients or bill existing patients at a higher level of service, having a resident is going to add financial value. Of course, having residents doesn't just increase attending billing, it also increases the hospital's ability to bill for its services. A financially happy hospital is one where the ICUs are full, there's rapid bed turnover in the ED and on the wards, and all the lab and radiology departments are abuzz with the latest diagnostics. Residents are extremely valuable in keeping up that pace. Moreover, having residents allows a hospital to care for higher acuity patients. It's pretty difficult to provide high-level oncology or cardiovascular care unless you have residents and fellows to share that kind of intense clinical workload. And having residents leads to other indirect financial benefits for hospitals that are even harder to quantify. Many hospitals, for instance, spend a lot of money on physician recruitment, but you may find that it's easier to recruit a new attending to come to a hospital when there are residents to help out with the on-call duties. And since many new attendings actually take jobs at the same institution where they did their residency, having a residency program can give the institution access to a steady stream of junior attendings without having to pay for third-party recruiters and expensive national searches. And this may be one reason, in addition to the ones that I've previously mentioned, why HCA Healthcare, the nation's largest for-profit hospital chain, has recently become the single biggest sponsor of residency positions in the United States. Still, it's very difficult to put a dollar figure on how much the hospital benefits from having residents, because the benefits are indirect and they're apparent only upon inspection of the financial data for the system as a whole. It's easier and a whole lot more strategic for hospitals just to ignore the indirect financial benefits of having residents. Because when you do, it allows you to use selective accounting and then claim that your residency program is actually a money loser and that you're administering it only out of educational benevolence. And if you have not heard hospital administrators make these kind of arguments, then I'll tell you, I'm happy for you. I will, regrettably, have to return to this topic again in a few minutes, but for now I'd like to move on to another way that having residents improves the finances of the hospital that employs them. In addition to increasing revenue for attending physicians and the hospitals, having residents often enables an additional revenue stream of governmental subsidies. Now, this wasn't always the case. Back in the old days, hospitals paid for resident training by just building those costs into the bills that they sent patients. But that all changed in 1965 with the passage of the Social Security Act, because at that point, Congress acknowledged that training medical residents was a public good and it was deserving of public investment, and they established federal funding for graduate medical education costs through the Medicare Act. What's interesting about this story is that Congress intended that the public funding for residencies would be temporary. And there was this language in both the House and Senate reports that said that governmental funds were intended to last only until, quote, the community undertakes to bear such educational costs in some other way, end quote. Of course, unsurprisingly, once governmental funds became available, hospitals had little interest in undertaking how to bear these costs in any other way. Nowadays, the Medicare subsidy for graduate medical education comes in two parts. The first is what's called direct GME or DME funds. And as the name suggests, it's intended to offset the direct costs of training residents, things like pay for the residents' salaries, or give faculty teaching stipends, or pay for the program administration or building maintenance. The exact amount that a hospital receives for DME varies. It's a complicated formula. You start with a regional per resident amount, which is based on funding models from the 1980s, which have since been adjusted for inflation. And you end up with an average per resident amount in 2017 of $102,875 for a primary care resident and $100,956 for other residents. But then you have to discount that figure based on the percentage of inpatient days for Medicare patients at that resident's institution. The second payment from Medicare covers what are called indirect GME expenses, or IME. And these are intended to compensate hospitals for the purported increased expenses of training residents. So this was all negotiated back in 1983 based on the argument that residents order more expensive and unnecessary tests and that physicians that were engaged in teaching residents become more inefficient as a consequence of having to teach, and that hospitals that have residents are more likely to care for complicated and complex patients and they have to invest in the most expensive technology. Whether all or any of these arguments is actually true is actually debatable. But what's beyond dispute is that IME funds have grown to become the single biggest piece of residency funding for most programs. Let's take a look at some real numbers. Let's take a look at some real numbers. This figure comes from a paper that was in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2020, and it shows the average amount per resident that's paid by Medicare for direct medical education and indirect medical education. And you can see that while direct medical education payments have been flat at about $45,000 per resident as of 2015, indirect medical education payments have continued to increase and averaged around $105,000 in 2015. Now, these figures are just averages, and there's wide variation in how much each hospital receives. In fact, if you want to know exactly how much your hospital received, there's a downloadable CSV file at the CMS website, and I'll link to it in the show notes. Medicare's IME payments get calculated as a percentage add-on for each Medicare DRG payment that the hospital receives. If you're not familiar, DRG means diagnosis related group, and it's the way that Medicare classifies the services that it'll pay for. So there's a DRG for community acquired pneumonia or total hip replacement, and it's the way that Medicare decides how much it's going to pay the hospital for that service. But how that percentage add-on gets calculated gets complicated, and ultimately there are very wide disparities in IME payments to hospitals. Matter of fact, around one-fifth of teaching hospitals end up getting two-thirds of all the IME payments. So that average that we saw a slide ago, that really has a pretty broad range. Of course, there's also a pretty broad range in the number of Medicare patients that various hospitals and their residency programs take care of. I mean, if you've got an inpatient-based residency program, something like internal medicine, well, you've probably got a lot of Medicare patients, and you're probably going to receive generous IME subsidies. On the other hand, if you've got an obstetrics-heavy OBGYN program, you probably got very few Medicare patients, and you're going to qualify for very little in IME. Now, this kind of program might see a lot of patients with Medicaid, and although most states' Medicaid programs provide some GME subsidy, the amount is highly variable. It ranges from essentially zero in some states like West Virginia to over $1 billion a year for programs in New York. Similarly, with the exception of a handful of children who have end-stage kidney disease and qualify for Medicare, pediatric residents care for no Medicare beneficiaries and they receive no IME payments. Now, there is a different federal program called CHGME or Children's Hospital GME that provides subsidies to freestanding children's hospitals, but only about half of pediatric residents train in freestanding children's hospitals versus hospitals within a hospital. The point is, IME funding is complicated. And if all that isn't complicated enough, well, not every residency position even qualifies for direct or DME funding either. Because as part of the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, Congress capped the number of residents that were eligible for DME funding at 1996 levels. This is an interesting story and probably one that I'll cover at some point, but to be brief, this was during the managed care era, and there were serious concerns that the United States was soon going to be oversupplied with doctors. After some think tanks put out public reports saying that U.S. medical schools should decrease their class sizes, the AMC took action. The problem wasn't too many medical school graduates. Certainly not. The problem was that there were too many residency positions, and so the AMC began lobbying Congress forcefully to limit in some way the number of first-year positions that were offered in the United States. They did this by capping the amount that Medicare would pay in DME payments to remove some of the financial incentive to create new residency positions. The cap on DME funding worked, at least temporarily. What I'm showing you here is the growth in PGY1 positions that are offered in the NRMP match from 1997 to 2022. Now listen, the number of PGY1 positions that's available in the match, it's an imperfect surrogate for the actual number of PGY1 positions available, but it's a good first approximation. And you can see how in 1997, there were a little over 20,000 PGY1 positions offered in the match. Last year, that was over 36,000, growth of 75%. And you can see how growth was initially maybe a little bit slower in the first few years after the DME cap and has increased at a higher rate over the past 10 to 15 years. Now, as a side note, sometimes when you talk about the DME cap in casual conversations or on social media, um, you'll come across people who mistakenly believe that Congress directly capped the number of residency positions available and that residency positions aren't growing. And neither of those things is true. Congress simply limited the amount of funds that it would provide in those DME payments. Hospitals have always been free to make residency positions. They just got to pay for them some other way. And in fact, this rapid growth in GME positions should provide strong empirical evidence that that DME payment is not necessary for hospitals to make money off of a given residency position. So how much are residents worth? It should be clear by this point that based on the number of variables involved and the difficulty, if not impossibility, of pinning them down with certainty, defining a given resident's financial value is a challenging task. But that hasn't stopped some experts from trying. In Elisabeth Rosenthal's excellent book, An American Sickness, she notes, the median cost to a hospital for each full-time resident in 2013 was $134,803. That includes a salary of between $50,000 and $80,000. Federal support translates into about $100,000 per resident per year. Researchers have calculated that the value of work each resident performs annually is $232,726. Even without any subsidy, having residents is a better than break-even deal. If these numbers are accurate, and a resident performs $232,000 worth of work and also entitles the hospital to another $100,000 of governmental funding, they certainly could be paid a lot more than this $50,000 to $80,000. But how accurate is this $232,000 figure here? It's not entirely clear what researchers Rosenthal was citing, but that same dollar figure I found in a paper that estimates the value of unreimbursed procedures that are performed by surgical residents. So yeah, it's an eye-popping figure, sure, but one that hardly seems generalizable or comprehensive enough to inform broad debates. Instead, the question of how much value a resident adds over their training costs was most authoritatively analyzed in 2013 by the Rand Corporation. This is the cover page of their 74-page analysis, and they calculated that the value of adding an additional internal medicine resident is somewhere between negative $101,000 and positive $253,000. And it's based on the availability of governmental subsidies and variability in training costs and changes in clinical revenue. I find the RAND analyses to be highly credible. And if you don't like the ranges of value that they came up with, then I challenge you to read the report, which comprehensively goes through all of the financial inputs and outputs that go into resident value, and tell me which of their particular estimates you disagree with. Still, if I bring up these figures on Twitter, I get a lot of pushback from residents that say, there is no way that my job is losing $100,000 for the hospital. And I got to say, they've got a point. I mean, sure, it's possible to create a residency position that's a money loser. I mean, add a position that doesn't generate any additional attending billing in a hospital that doesn't get any additional federal subsidy, and yeah, it could be a money loser. But it strains credulity to believe that hospitals would choose to create such a position. Why would hospitals voluntarily choose to expand the residency if, in fact, it was a money loser? So if you just take the midpoint of the RAND estimate, this negative 101 to $253,000, then you'd say the average resident generates a profit of $76,366 for the hospital. But if we assume that the only residency positions that hospitals would choose to create are ones in which they believe they're going to be financial winners, well, then it's probably reasonable to take the midpoint of the positive integers from the RAND estimate. And that would give us a figure of $126,955 in the hospital's favor. Of course, that RAND study came out in 2013, and so if we increase dollars at the rate of inflation, we come up with a point estimate of $161,462 in 2022 dollars. And this, my friends, this is the number. The single best point estimate of what the average medicine resident brings into their hospital above their training costs in the year 2022, $161,462. But before I conclude, an addendum. I first posted about this topic a few months ago on my website, and I gotta say, it generated some of the most negative pushback that I've gotten from anything that I've ever written about, which really is kind of impressive. Some of it came from residents who were incredulous that I included any negative estimates in a resident's value. From their standpoint, that was not a good faith argument. And like I said, I agree. I think hospitals are too smart to voluntarily add residency positions that are financial losers. But the fundamental point that all residency positions are money winners, that just simply cannot be true. And I think that any serious discussion on this topic's got to acknowledge that. Take a residency program that's got 10 residents. Say I make a new one and I want to have 365 residents in the program so that everybody's only on call one day out of the year. Um, how much money is each of those residents worth? Is it inevitable that adding the residents increases the financial revenues of the hospital? Certainly not. In a more realistic sense, say I've got an ER residency and I add another resident, but the attendings may like it. I mean, they've got fewer patients that they have to see themselves. But unless there were patients that were leaving before they were seen because the wait times were too long, or patients were moving too slowly through the ER so that the wards were full and you had to turn away transfers. Unless something like that's true, simply adding a resident does not increase the money unless you have some generous federal subsidy, which most residency programs are not going to get. But a little bit more surprising than that, and probably more deserving of a thoughtful rebuttal, are some of the messages that I got from senior faculty, even former program directors and department chairs. I had two people compare having a residency program to being like having a luxury item. One person compared it to having a yacht, another to a sports car. The analogy was the same. It's a status symbol and it requires a big financial input and then ongoing financial inputs just to keep it afloat. But it's not something you do because of its intrinsic value. It's something that you do to maintain prestige. There was another interesting message from a faculty member who shared with me how her department had increased by two the number of residents that they had. And after they did that, clinical revenues decreased. And now she was telling me how she's under pressure from her chairperson to open a Saturday morning clinic in order to generate more RVUs. So, where to begin? I mean, look, it is certainly possible that some hospitals have chosen to create residency programs or positions that are actually, in real fact, money losers. And even when they see they're money losers, they choose to keep them going. But I'm very deeply skeptical about claims of financial losses, at least if you consider accounting broadly. Let me tell you what I mean. It is a classic trick of hospital administration to silo off little pieces of the business, and then you insist that each of these tiny little silos, they have to keep their individual balance sheets in the black. So let me give you a hypothetical example. Suppose that you're the director of the code carts for the hospital, and your administrator demands that you keep the code carts in the black. Well, you know what? It may be a hard thing to do because how often do the code carts get used? I mean, sometimes you're having to, replace the supplies because they expire and they haven't even been used. And how much can you even bill those little epinephrine syringes for anyhow? I mean, it might not be a money-making business. But obviously, if you didn't have the code card, you couldn't do anything else that you're doing in the hospital. The existence of a functioning code card enables the hospital to perform high value surgical procedures and admit inpatients and do all of the lucrative things that help make the hospital an overall financial success. You don't really care if you lose a dollar here or there on an expired, unusual sized ET tube or angiocath that you have to keep stocked, but you don't use it all that often. You don't care about those dollars because they enable bigger dollars down the line. But by demanding that the middle manager who's managing the code cards run keep their operation in the black, you'll encourage them to be as tight-fisted as they possibly can because they think they're losing all this money. Here's a more realistic example. Many hospitals assert that they lose money on their obstetric units. So if you're an administrator, you go to the obstetricians, you show them all the red on their balance sheet, and you can tell them with a straight face how you just can't possibly justify devoting any more financial resources to their service line because it's so unprofitable. Of course, this kind of selective accounting ignores the fact that if you didn't have an obstetric unit, the hospital wouldn't be able to pull off its profitable neonatal intensive care unit. Those dollars, they don't show up in obstetrics, they show up in the pediatrics ledger. You know, an old friend of mine from medical school, he works as an emergency medicine physician in a major academic hospital. Every year, he and his department get told how they got to work faster, they got to work smarter because the ED is just it's hemorrhaging money. Everybody's got to pitch in. We got to shore up the losses. But every couple of years, the hospital expands the ED capacity and it expands the staffing. And I got to say, that's an awfully curious thing to do for a service that's purportedly hemorrhaging money. So if you look at the books and you consider the ED's revenues and their expenses in isolation, it may very well not pay for itself. But again, is that fair accounting? Because if you don't have the ED to feed the wards or the ICUs or the OR or the cath lab, your hospital is going to leave a lot of money on the table. But by using this budgetary gerrymandering, you can carefully silo off clinical departments and make a system in which the majority of the hospital services are claimed to be financial losers, when in reality, they're necessary loss leaders for an overall profitable enterprise. I strongly suspect that this same kind of selective accounting applies to most of the assertions about residents having negative financial value. To see the true picture of a resident's financial impact requires being able to see the institution's complete financial picture, and that's something that program directors and even department chairs simply do not see. It also requires an honest financial evaluation of the no resident counterfactual and the revenue losses that would occur or the replacement costs that would be incurred if you lost those residents. That's why the New Mexico example that we talked about at the beginning is such a powerful one. I said it before, but I'm going to say it one last time in closing. It simply beggars belief. Those who are in a position to see the full balance sheets and do the calculus required would choose to create or maintain residency positions that are financial losers. Say what you want about hospital administrators, but they're not dummies. The fact that HCA, the nation's largest for-profit hospital, has now become the greatest sponsor of GME, that tells you all that you need to know. These are savvy business people. They know not to throw good money after bad, and they know how to pounce on a good deal when they see one. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening.